In the fields and villages of Central Europe, the echo of the Protestant Reformation still resonated deeply in the 18th century. The Alsace region, a crossroads between cultures and kingdoms, was home to Amish communities descended from radical Anabaptists. These groups, marginalized by their beliefs in adult baptism, nonviolence, and the separation of church and state, lived on the margins of society. For them, peaceful resistance and unwavering faith were their only defense against a hostile world. Soldiers of the Holy Roman Empire patrolled villages and fields, searching for heretics who did not abide by the religious laws imposed by the emperor and prince-electors. Secret meetings in stables or isolated farms were held under the constant threat of discovery. For the Amish, the simple act of gathering together, sharing a prayer, or reading a scripture quietly was an act of bravery and defiance. Many faced fines, prison, or banishment. In 1730, Jakob Ammann, the charismatic spiritual leader for whom the Amish movement was named, died. His death left a void in the community. But his legacy remained: a resilient faith, a commitment to simple living, and a fierce refusal to compromise his principles, even in the face of suffering. Meanwhile, in the courts of Europe, the winds of change were beginning to blow. In 1780, a young monarch, Joseph II of Austria, ascended the throne. Son of Mara Teresa, he had been educated in the ideas of the Enlightenment. He believed that religious tolerance could bring stability to his domains, fragmented by centuries of confessional conflicts. But for the Amish, isolated in their rural communities, the rise of Joseph II was no cause for hope. From their perspective, the promises of the powerful always arrived late, or, worse still, with conditions that sought to change their way of life. The survival of the Amish hung by a thread. While their neighbors began to accept the promises of modernity and imperial reforms, they remained firm in their decision to live on the margins, faithful to a faith that had condemned them to be foreigners in their own land. In 1781, Joseph I's Edict of Toleration promised radical change in the lives of religious minorities in the Holy Roman Empire. For the first time in centuries, Anabaptists, including the Amish, could practice their faith without the constant fear of imprisonment or execution. Although the document imposed conditions, such as the official registration of their communities and the obligation to contribute financially to the state, the promise of religious freedom resonated strongly. In the valleys of Alsace, where the Amish had lived for generations under the shadow of persecution, the news came quickly. The elders of the community, accustomed to years of secrecy, organized discreet meetings in stables and barns to discuss the implications of the edict. Can we trust these words? They asked themselves. For younger leaders such as Samuel Hochstetler, the edict was both a hope and a warning. History had shown that the promises of the powerful could be ephemeral. Over time, life in Amish villages began to change. Although they continued to face high tax rates and social prejudices, soldier raids and arbitrary arrests disappeared. The possibility of praying and educating their children at home, according to their own beliefs, opened a space of relative tranquility. However, for some, this new era of tolerance was not enough. The Amish, who had immigrated to America decades earlier, sent letters telling how the land and freedom there were broader, more authentic. In Alsace, the communities were divided. Some saw the edict as an opportunity to preserve their faith in the land of their ancestors. Others, disillusioned by the long history of betrayals, were beginning to plan their own exodus to the New World, following in the footsteps of their relatives on the other side of the Atlantic. Although the Edict of Toleration had brought hope, it also raised a difficult question: stay and trust in the future, or leave in search of unfettered freedom. While the Edict of Toleration marked a significant change in Europe, the Amish of America faced challenges of a different kind. In the hills of Pennsylvania, where the first Amish had arrived in the early 18th century, religious freedom seemed guaranteed. However, the promise of the New World came with its own cost. Johannes Stoltzfus, a young farmer who had left Alsace with his family as a child, wrote regularly to his relatives who remained in Europe. In his letters, he described a place of great opportunities, but also of deep tensions. Here, the land is fertile, and the laws allow us to live according to our faith, Johannes wrote, but we must pay a price: the isolation of our traditions and the constant temptation to assimilate modern customs. In America, the Amish lived surrounded by a rapidly changing world. The growth of cities, trade, and industrialization were forces that challenged their simple life. Johannes recounted how some young people were beginning to question the rules of the community, attracted by the promise of prosperity and personal freedom that American society offered. Meanwhile, in Alsace, Samuel Hochstetler worked tirelessly to maintain the cohesion of his community under the conditions of the Edict of Toleration. However, tensions continued to grow. The rise of nationalism in Europe brought with it pressures for all minorities to adopt the language, customs, and loyalties of the emerging states. For Samuel, the edict was not a gift, but a precarious balance that could crumble at any moment. True freedom is not granted, he wrote in his diary. It is defended, day after day, with sacrifice and faith. In America and Europe, the Amish shared a common challenge: preserving their way of life in the face of outside forces that sought to shape them. Although separated by an ocean, they were united in a silent struggle to keep alive a tradition that defined them. At the end of the 18th century, the Amish lived in a world divided by oceans and challenges. In Europe, Joseph I's Edict of Toleration had offered a brief truce. For almost a decade, Amish communities in Alsace and other regions enjoyed a less persecuted life. But this respite came at a cost. With the edict came new demands: mandatory registration of their communities, additional taxes, and pressures to participate in the social and cultural systems of the emerging nation-states. Each generation faced a growing threat of assimilation. In America, the Amish had begun to forge a life on vaster and seemingly freer lands. However, this freedom had its own challenges. Letters sent from Pennsylvania spoke of isolation, of the struggle to maintain separation from outside influences, and of the difficulties of preserving traditions against the temptations of progress. Amish families who had crossed the Atlantic discovered that maintaining simplicity and community in a promising and changing world required constant effort. In 1790, after the death of Joseph II, the fragile Edict of Toleration began to crumble. The Austrian monarch's successors did not share his enlightened vision, and the policies of tolerance were gradually revoked. For Samuel Hochstetler and other Amish leaders in Europe, this was a stark reminder that government promises were rarely permanent. "Faith must be our strength," Samuel wrote in his journal. "The laws of men are like leaves in the wind, but our belief in God is a rock that cannot be moved." Despite the difficulties, the faith of the Amish did not waver. In Europe, they endured growing discrimination and cultural pressures, while some began to consider an exodus to America. Across the Atlantic, the Amish were working to establish an identity that would stand the test of time and the influence of a changing world. The Edict of Toleration was a milestone, but also a lesson for the Amish. They learned that true freedom does not come from decrees of the powerful, but of the internal strength of a community dedicated to its principles. As empires rose and fell, the faith of the Amish remained unwavering, proof that devotion can survive even the most difficult challenges.